So welcome to this evening's discussion around Lizzie Thynne's wonderful new film, Independent Miss Craigie, which is started to stream on our platform on the 3rd, and it's streaming until the 17th of December. And Jill Craigie is one of the first women to direct films in Britain, for those who might not have watched the film yet. Tonight we've got three wonderful people to discuss the film. We've got the filmmaker Lizzie here. I'm not going to read out everybody's full bios because we haven't got a huge amount of time, but I'll just read the first couple of lines from people's bios. So Lizzie is a filmmaker and writer on media and film. Her work often explores women's life histories, particularly the lives of female cultural producers, and has been widely shown in galleries, exhibitions, festivals, and on television. Then we have Penny Wilcock. Penny Wilcock is a director who works across different genres, documentary and fiction, television, film, and opera. And we have Ros Cranston. Ros is a curator of non-fiction film and television at the BFI National Archive. And before I hand over to Lizzie, I wanted to draw your attention to Rachel Pronger's wonderful new blog that she's written for us on this film, entitled Political, Passionate and Unapologetic. I urge you to, when you finished being with us this evening, to go to the Cinema of Ideas website or the ICO's website, and you can read Rachel's new writing. So I'm delighted to hand over to Lizzie Thynne, who's the filmmaker, and Lizzie's going to tell us about her film, about the project, and we're also going to be watching a clip too. So Lizzie, over to you.
Thank you very much, Selena, and thank you very much, Sammy, and everyone at the ICO for hosting this event and streaming our film. It's a great privilege to be here, and thank you so much for everyone for joining us tonight, and Penny and Ros for taking part in this discussion. And also I have to thank our funders, the Arts and Humanities Research Council, who've generously funded the film and a wider project that it's part of, which is called Jill Craigie Film Pioneer, which is a project based at the University of Sussex. So there will also be a book coming out about Jill Craigie in probably the year after next. So first of all, I just wanted to say a few words about the film and why I did it and why we're doing the project. And I suppose it's not only to kind of recognise Jill Craigie's achievements as a director, although they were interesting and significant, but it's also to look at what her career might tell us about the obstacles as well as some of the opportunities that women directors faced at that period, and maybe also now in some ways. So I think just to talk a little bit about, I guess, her achievements. I mean, I think a couple of the things that are most interesting about her, from my point of view, is she created one of the first arts documentaries called Out of Chaos, which was really the first film to show artists at work, and has some of the first footage of sort of well-known directors like Henry Moore and Paul Nash. But also she was very interested in documenting their process in a way that hadn't really been done before. And secondly, she was also innovative, I think, in the way that she worked with non-professional actors. I mean, obviously, many people in the history of film have done that, but I think what she did was particularly interesting in that she cast local people, often to do scripted drama. And although other members of the documentary movement, which he was sort of outside of really, also got everyday ordinary people to perform themselves, she was, I think, quite unusual in getting them to perform scripted drama sequences within her documentary, famously The Way We Live, which is a very interesting film about the rebuilding of Plymouth after the war, for those of you that haven't seen the film yet. Where she did wide research about what people thought about how the town should be rebuilt after the Blitz, and what they thought of this amazing modernist plan by Abercrombie to rebuild the town centre as well as the outskirts of the city. So those are some of the amazing things she did. But also, what was also interesting to me as a filmmaker was that she seemed to be one of the most photographed women, not only women directors, but actually directors of the period. She often seemed to be photographed as if she was a star rather than a director. So you've got these lovely glamour portraits of her, as well as interesting portraits of her, publicity pictures of her on shoots where she's surrounded by an entirely male crew, apart from the continuity supervisor, who was nearly always a woman, and still is, of course, nearly always a woman. And so that was interesting that she was, you know, photographed in this way. And I was kind of intrigued by this. And I wanted to kind of juxtapose these photographs of her with her own voice, both from interviews. So from the British Entertainment History Project has 2 key interviews with her, as well as, if you like, her reconstituted voice from her papers, particularly the ones held in the Women's Library and other documents that we were lent during the production. And there was an interesting contrast between her later interviews and her younger self, where she appeared very confident and assertive in her letters to the artists, for instance, or to Abercrombie, or to all these other male authority figures that she had to kind of get on board. And she appeared very confident and assertive compared with her later self, which she tended to dismiss her work and be quite critical of it. And so I was sort of intrigued by this and why this had happened in her life. I mean, was it to do with, you know, changes in the film industry? Was it to do with women being booted out of, you know, having more creative roles in the industry after the war? And what also maybe happened in her personal life, because none of these things, it's never simple really, but I think it was a kind of combination of things that I wanted to explore, not necessarily have an answer to, but explore in the film. So one of the things that was also very innovative about Craigie and interesting, I think, for us as kind of modern filmmakers, is that she kind of, well, I don't know of any other filmmakers at the time that did this kind of crowdfunding that she did for her lovely film, which is probably the most progressive and the most modern looking to our eyes, which is called To Be a Woman, which is a wonderful film about a campaigning film about equal pay that she made in 1951. And when I saw this, I thought, my goodness, you know, this feels like, you know, 20 or 30 years later. And it sort of was like a kind of arrow from the past, because it's so sort of radical, it seemed, for the time. And so I was very intrigued by that. And I discovered, and that was one of the most interesting things for me. I knew she was always interested in the suffragettes, but what became clear from our research was that many of the people that she worked with to get that film made and raise the money was the Equal Pay campaign, which actually started in the 30s. And many of the leading lights were suffragettes. So there was a very interesting link there between the past of feminism and Craigie's own feminism, because obviously between the suffragettes and the war, there wasn't a very visible women's movement, but she made this connection in a really interesting way in that film. And as I say, it was raised by donations, often from, well, mainly from women union members, especially the National Union of Women Teachers, who were, you know, I guess because they were professional women, they were in a position to kind of lobby for equal pay, which they did achieve in 55. So I just wanted to show you a short clip from the section of the film which is about To Be a Woman. So when you're ready, Sammy, could we see the clip? Thank you.
When the war ended, the new look came in, and there was tremendous excitement. The new look was rather full skirts at a time when we were still supposed to be economized. The debutantes came back. It was a return to the class system in a big way. It smacked to me of being difficult for socialists, all that.
woman of 1950. How does she compare with the woman of 100 years ago? The creature that John Stuart Mill found in a state of subjection.
I first proposed the film to the National Union of Women Teachers in 1948.
A woman in a job in 20th century Britain is still made to feel inferior. She's not paid the rate for the job. She's cheap labor.
Dear Secretary, I would very much like to make a short film to put forward your case for equal pay. I am quite convinced this could do more to advance your cause than almost anything else. The only town plan to have made real headway is the Plymouth Plan, and it is freely admitted that this is largely due to my film, The Way We Live. Women teachers had almost been awarded equal pay. An amendment to the 1944 Education Act had been passed by one vote. Churchill then made the issue a matter of confidence in the government. MPs were not prepared to bring the government down with the war still on, and the amendment was defeated. Churchill had also been a bitter opponent of women's suffrage, but Labour hadn't done enough either to support pay equality.
In the new industries, plastics, light metal, radio, employers hardly consider taking on men at all. That is why in other industries, men are fighting to keep women out altogether.
They're right. They must guard against unemployment.
Great, thank you, Lizzie. I had another quick question for you before we turn to Penny. Can you tell us a little about, the clip that you showed us there is you're working with lots of different archives and archive material. Can you tell us a little bit more about the archives that you worked in and the team that you worked with? Because this has been a 3-year project, hasn't it? And can you tell us a little bit more about the nuts and bolts of how it all came about? Because it's a hugely ambitious project.
Yes, well, I was very lucky to have 2 brilliant associate producers who were research fellows on the project. Adele Tully, who is a brilliant filmmaker herself, and she did the first year, and then the last 2 years were done by Holly Price, who is a really absolutely brilliant archive researcher. So I had, the best of both worlds, really. So Holly researched a huge range of archives, and particularly, actually the BFI Special Collections, the Women's Library, as I say, which has, most of Craigie's papers, which we digitized and we're using for other research as well. And then I was also very lucky to be lent a suitcase of documents which had unseen papers of Craigie's, particularly the production folder for the film I mentioned, the wonderful film about artists. So that had correspondence with Moore and Nash and so on, and Piper, John Piper, who declined to be in the film in the end because he said he didn't want to look like an idiot, because people were of course not used to being filmed, and he had actually been on television in the 30s, interestingly, and he didn't like the way he came across. But anyway, so there was an interesting exchange between the two of them. So that was one thing. And then of course there was all the moving image archive you mentioned in relation to that clip. Obviously there's some Pathé footage at the beginning. I mean, I think that sort of set the scene for the 50s, and her sort of slight sense of disappointment, that we were going back to the debutantes, we were going back to the class system after hoping that Britain was going to, change in more radical ways after the war and the Labour government and so on. And then, that sense of slight disillusionment, really. But nonetheless, this kind of very feisty film, which is, as you see, the dialogue between a man and a woman. So most of the other shots in that sequence are actually from the film itself, from her film, To Be a Woman.
I guess also, that clip and your film so beautifully kind of lays out these questions about the politics of the archive and the conditions for female filmmakers, in the post-war era, specifically in the documentary kind of movement, and the power of the archive to silence, or kind of or kind of make visible as we're doing now. And I just wanted to actually, sorry, I should have said this at the beginning. If anyone's got any questions or comments, please do send them through to us as we're talking, because we want it to be more kind of interactive with people asking questions as we go along, that we don't necessarily need to leave the questions.
Yeah, we'd love to hear what you think.
Yeah, just if you've seen
good or bad, if you've seen the film, or just general questions, that'd be good.
So please do, don't be shy, send through anything you want to say in the chat. But I wanted to turn to Penny now, because Penny, I mean, we're talking a bit about the politics of the archive, about invisibility and visibility. And when we emailed you to see if you wanted to participate in the panel, you were intrigued because you said you've just been commissioned to write an article on Marion Grierson for Ros's project, which we're going to talk about later, and that you were just quite perplexed about how this generation of post-war female filmmakers, documentary filmmakers, had been, completely sort of written out of history. Can you say a little bit more about writing this article on Marion Grierson, how your ideas were being formed around that?
Well, the reason I was asked to write the article is because I'd made a film, an archive film from the BFI called From the Sea to the Land Beyond. And what was interesting about that, and, I really loved Lizzie's very clever film, is that it's not just that women filmmakers were sort of booted out, Lizzie said, of the film industry, but booted out of the picture altogether, because when I looked at the archive in the first, at least good quarter of the 20th century, women were very present. So in the Mitchell and Kenyon footage, there were these young working class women boldly coming up to the camera and announcing themselves. And then there were lots of images of women sort of doing calisthenics on the beach, or, smoking dressed as men and doing various different jobs, which obviously carried through into the war. And then in the second half of the century, they literally disappeared out of the picture. I couldn't find footage of a woman who wasn't carrying a mop or in a beauty pageant. And it was really shocking, actually. And, I'm also shocked at my own ignorance in that when this first came up, I knew Jill Craigie as Michael Foot's wife. And when I asked a few other we have friends who know about film, they said, oh yeah, she was Michael Foot's wife. And one friend actually thought she was Tony Benn's wife. But while making the film, I'd come across a very beautiful little film by Marion Grierson, who was then known, of course, as John Grierson's sister, and her sister Ruby, again, very accomplished and inventive filmmaker, again known as John Grierson's sister. They somehow were sort of wiped out of film history. And Beside the Seaside is a really lovely film. It has one very kind of clumsy interlude with two performers sort of blacked up performing in Broadstairs, but it's unfortunate because it's out of tune with the way that the rest of the film is made. There's a lovely W.H. Auden poem and it has some children playing on the beach looking into a puddle, and then the point of view of this crab that they're playing with, and these very sort of inventive soundscapes and a really interesting use of music. And you just think, well, what happened? She got married is what happened, and then never made another film. So and then I sort of discovered that there were a whole group of women who were very active at that time, because there was a little bit of space that was because the men were sort of at war, I suppose. And then as soon as the men came back and took over, they were literally sort of removed. And when Ros asked me to write something about Marion Grierson, I literally couldn't find anything. There was the odd little piece, and generally her name was not spelt right. In one of them, she was known as Margaret Grierson. And so that it was as if somehow she had sort of fallen into some kind of black hole along with these other very interesting filmmakers. So I think this is a very timely film, and I was so pleased to see it. And I think the way Lizzie put it together, which is slightly kind of mimicking the style, the different styles that Jill Craigie used. So it was really clever, and it's a very sort of heartening and celebratory film of, you know, somebody who was a bad mother, you know, at least in her childhood, which, you know, so she's not presented as some kind of heroine, but she's a creative woman trying to do her work.
I couldn't agree with you more. And I just wanted to ask, what did it mean for you when you found these women in the archive? Because, you know, your way of working, your process is quite similar to Jill Craigie in terms of you work with communities, you have a more of a participatory way of working with non-professional actors. I'm thinking about when, you know, the first time I saw your film Tina Goes Shopping, when I was at the Sheffield Doc Fest when I was much younger, and it really made a huge impact on me. And I think when we spoke before, you know, you yourself said you didn't go to film school, you were just finding a way to express how and the way of working, how you wanted to work. So what did it mean for you when you found people like Jill Craigie and Marion Griss, and, you know, that there's a history?
Yes, and I think that the shame really is that we haven't built up this sense of community, you know, of women who've been trying to do something. And so each time you feel like you're the only one trying to do something by yourself. And I think when I made Tina Goes Shopping, the film you were talking about, it was really, I was trying to find a solution to a problem, which is how could I tell the truth about how people were surviving economically in these communities where there were no legitimate jobs, and, you know, social security doesn't actually enable people to survive without either, you know, getting posh people, actors to play them, because I knew, as they said, they were very good at performing because they were having to do it the whole time, you know, in court and to the police and the social services. And so there was this sort of enormous amount of creativity. And I thought, if people are trusting me with their stories, I'm going to, because I paid people to act, you know, we were all being paid. It's not a documentary, but it was good to give something back and to be, you know, give people an opportunity to do something they're proud of. And sometimes fiction is the only way in which you can really get close to the truth, because you can't always film things in a documentary way. So sometimes you can, and if you can't, you have to find another way of doing it. And I felt that was the way that was, you know, respectful to the talent and the kind of enormous resilience and resistance that very poor communities have, who are looked down on and called, you know, the underclass or the lumpenproletariat or whatever. I really hate all of that. And for people to be able to occupy that space and tell their own stories is very powerful. And then it was really intriguing to find that Jill Craigie had done the same thing, and so had other filmmakers like Jean Rouch, who I also wasn't aware of, and the Italian neorealists. So I think I was treading a very well trodden path, but I thought I was the only one.
Because I was just rewatched Lizzie's film today, and I think the really kind of moments in Craigie's film, Who Are the Vandals, that really resonate with some of the early films that you were making in quite sort of uncanny ways. And then also The Way We Live, there's just incredible sort of correlation. But I think, you know, you're right, this is the issue in the politics of kind of doing women's film history, is that these histories need to be passed down through the next generation. And if they're not, then they just become lost. And that's just like a massive problem for film history, at large. And I'd like to sort of turn to Ros now, if that's okay. Ros, you've been working on a project in the BFI for quite a long time, documenting British women, researching British women documentary filmmakers. And there's a season at the BFI coming out in May, a film season called The New March. Sorry. The Camera Is Ours. The new name, The Camera Is Ours. So can you tell us a little bit? And Jill Craigie obviously is in this season, and Marion Griss and and Kay Manders, lots of women whose names I had never heard of myself. I mean, like Penny, with Jill Craigie, I just knew her as Michael Foot's wife. I mean, it's just terrible. So can you tell us a little bit what you've been doing in the archive, how you've been working in the archive, and some of the women that you've been finding in the archive?
Well, yeah, it's great to see independent Miss Craigie, I must say, and very neat that the timing is coinciding with the launch of our BFI project, The Camera Is Ours. And it's much more than a season at BFI South Bank, I must say. I'll plug it a bit more at the end. And yeah, so we're interested in, women documentary makers, past and present. And it was actually, and Jill Craigie knew herself that she wasn't the only female director by any means. So she was often hailed as such, so it's understandable why people might think that's the case. But so we're interested in telling the stories of women directors, both before her and following on from her. And like Penny, it was actually Marion Grierson's work that probably first drew me into the fascination with realizing there were quite a lot of these women. Started off with having a vague awareness that John Grierson had a couple of filmmaking sisters, and he set up the documentary movement, and they were often referred to as the documentary boys. But there were quite a number of women working in directing and in other roles in the documentary film movement, and just as intrigued by their stories and their films, some of which we'll be focusing on. I mean, key part of the project is that we're digitally restoring 10 short films by women documentary makers, both pre and post Jill Craigie. There's one of Jill Craigie's films there, it's Children of the Ruins, about the effect on children of war. And then there's also Marion Grierson's film Beside the Seaside. It's the earliest one of the 10 that we're digitally restoring. And yeah, like Penny, I was just surprised, shares so many of the characteristics that we cherish, that people interested in film cherish about Night Mail, and yet very few people have seen it or know it. And, as like Lizzie has mentioned about Jill Craigie being probably the most photographed film director of her era, Marion Grierson seems to be pretty much the least photographed. I mean, I've only been able to find one picture. I mean, like Penny was saying about trying to uncover these stories, there's great chunks of Marion Grierson's life I haven't been able to find out much at all about her. She did make about 10 films in the 1930s. Her light shone brightly for a short while, and then, as Penny said, she got married to another film director, and she moved into film journalism for a while, and then when she had children, she left the film industry altogether and became a youth worker. But I would, if Sammy can show this, this picture is quite something. I think it's just so unlike what we think of when we think of a film director. And this, I really love it. But it was taken some time after her filmmaking years were behind her. I like her look of determination, and I imagine that is likely to have been a trait that would have been required in women working in film, probably then and now. And I would like to just mention one other film director that we're focusing on in this project, whose name is Sarah Erlker. And she also began directing, well, she began directing the thing on in this project, whose name is Sarah Erlker. And she also began directing, well, she began directing in the 40s, I should say, and became very skillful. And here's a picture of her. And she had a really successful career, again, achieving great success very quickly, working in the Shell Film Unit. And she was of Indian Jewish heritage. And she said later in life, in an interview, she said, my main problem, she called it, was being a woman, not being Indian or Jewish. And she came very much up against that when she got married, working in the prestigious Shell Film Unit, making all sorts of documentaries on a huge range of topics, throughout her career. But she had to leave. I mean, she was senior to her husband, but there was no sort of question about it. She had to leave. You know, she didn't want to, and it set her back. You know, she was very upset, but she also, you know, demonstrated determination and had a supportive husband. And between them, they agreed, they shared sort of childcare so that they could both remain filmmakers. I mean, she quoted how he told her that he married a film director and he wanted to stay married to a film director. So, I mean, that's quite something. I think she recognised that she was, you know, that was unusual. Well, they both did. And she had a 4-decade career as a freelancer after being booted out of Shell, and worked for many different, you know, GPO, Central Office of Information, all sorts of organisations, educational organisations, and she won 2 BAFTAs. And interestingly, we've only kind of relatively recently realised this, but as far as we know, she was the first person of colour to have a career as a film director in the UK. I mean, and that, you know, that's quite a revelation. And that we hadn't really realised that before as well is kind of interesting. But anyway, so we're uncovering stories around 10 filmmakers in particular that they were digitally restoring their work, and then also we're bringing in contemporary filmmakers. We're keen to get their response, you know, like with Penny to Beside the Seaside, and so we're doing all sorts of events in March. So do look out, as well as the BFI South Bank season. We're also planning a touring programme with the ICO, and there'll be a DVD, and there'll be various online activities, and lots going on. So yeah, hope to see you there. Thanks.
Yeah, I mean,
No, Penny, please.
Yeah.
You go.
Well, I just remembered something that Ruby Grierson actually died. So she was on a boat that was bombed during the war. So whether she would have managed to keep going or not, we don't know. But one of the things that she said as a sort of criticism, really, of the way that she felt her brother and the boys were making films, was that they were looking at people as though they were in a fishbowl, and she wanted to smash the fishbowl. And I think you get that feeling of perhaps just wanting to be in the middle of things with people rather than sort of peering at them. And I mean, although I did feel with the Jill Craigie, it has this rather patrician sort of voiceover, doesn't she? That is a bit the way that the men were making these films as well. But there is still space for people to be themselves. And that seems to be something that, without really communicating with each other, they all shared. And actually, Marion, and I suppose there's no reason to disbelieve her, although it does seem a bit of a coincidence that she stopped filming as soon as she got married, you know, said that she liked being a youth worker because she wasn't observing life, she was actually in it, and she felt that she could do something. And so she did continue working. It's not as if she sort of retreated completely into domesticity. And, you know, we can all have that feeling sometimes, thinking, actually, why don't I just go and do something kind of that's directly helpful to people? Although I don't really believe that, actually, because I do think art is a really powerful tool for changing the world and for telling different stories. And this is how we all live, really, by the stories that we believe, isn't it? And so having different other voices, I think is so important, you know, because we all have different stories, different kind of vantage points from which to tell them.
No, absolutely. The stories we tell ourselves, each other, and what we pass down. Just talking about sort of why, you know, some of these women might have left filmmaking. We have a question that's come in to Lizzie. Why do you think Craigie stopped making films? Did she get disillusioned, or was it due to external factors?
Very good question indeed. I mean, I used the word booted out. Probably it's not quite as simple as that. Obviously, it never is quite as simple. But I mean, when we first started doing the project, I thought she had more or less stopped making any films at all in 1951, until she made one when she was 83 in 95 about the Serb attacks on the Croats and the atrocities going on in Yugoslavia. but it turns, so she did continue to try and make films. I think, as Ros and Penny have sort of hinted, I think it, there was definitely a kind of shift in ideology about women in the 50s, and maybe conflicting expectations of what women should be like, but also a big emphasis on marriage. So I think there was still an expectation, if you were married, that you should be looking after your husband, of course, and be the primary caregiver to children. And so even if you weren't sort of technically booted out, that was an issue. And I think, obviously, she was very in love with Foote. She wanted to support him. I think that definitely had an impact on her career. But she was, and he was very undomesticated. Various sources have told me, not only Julie, who's her daughter, who's in the film. So, there was a lot of domestic labor to be done. And of course, being a politician's wife, a lot of entertaining, etc. So a lot of those took up a lot of her time, without a doubt. But I mean, so I think, and then as I was suggesting also, there was the rape by Koestler. There was a number of things that were there to undermine her confidence as a sort of public woman, a woman, with a high profile career that she had. But I think, she was also somewhat disillusioned herself with the film industry. And she had very strong political interests. Like, she was very interested in the suffragettes. She went on researching them for years. She wrote a book about them, which sadly was never finished. So she did have other interests, and she did have other opportunities as well. But she was able to be a journalist, etc. So there were a number of factors in her case which maybe overlap with some other women's, as well as being slightly different because of her position as Foote's wife. But I know she was very jealous, for instance, of Muriel Box, who, continued to make features, but her husband, Sidney, was a producer, and she was quite jealous of that, although she apparently could have married McQuitty, who was her producer as well. But I think because she was very politically motivated, she was very idealistic. She loved Foote's, kind of socialism, and it matched her own, he was the one for her, So that's a long answer, but there isn't a simple answer. She did try to make films for the BBC, and she did make 2 in the 60s, which we discovered in the course of our project. So it wasn't as if she gave up, but maybe she didn't put as much time as she would have done into trying to. I mean, I think the thing is, nearly everybody, and Penny and I as well, from my freelance days, can kind of testify, nobody has not many people have regular work in film. So it's always a challenge to keep going, I think.
Yeah, and I think it is more of a challenge as a woman. So although it's complicated, it's actually not. I think it's also incredibly simple. She was very active in a period where there was more space for women, and then almost completely inactive after that, and had a better known husband. And I was a child in the 50s, and I spent my entire childhood saying I wanted to be a boy, because I did not want to be like my mother and her generation, because all they seemed to be able to do, this is in a sort of middle class, incredibly boring expat community in Argentina, was domestic labor, although, because it was there, usually people had some domestic help from, again, another woman, and sort of gossip about each other and complain about, maids and their husbands. And I genuinely didn't know anybody. I had one chemistry teacher who was a widow, and everybody felt sorry for her because she had to work. So it really, I didn't know anybody, any woman who was out in the world doing anything at all apart from Mrs. Best, the chemistry teacher, and good for her, but whether she felt sorry for herself, I don't know.
I mean, I think, that's your film, Lizzie, it really sort of impresses on us, what Craigie had to do to get her films made. The sort of the many faces of Craigie and the different talents that she had to kind of enact, and these confrontations that she had with Arthur Rank, you know, and also what she had to do and what she was willing to do to get her films in front of audiences, which is something that I'm really interested in, how she kind of distributed her, you know, she kind of distributed her films, you know, and she kind of, you know, she found those audiences. Can you tell us a little bit about that, you know, especially, you know, to be a woman, and how, you know, she worked with the WWII and, you know, to kind of build the audience for that film in particular?
Yes, to be a woman. Yes, I think that was, you know, a lot of there were prints that went around, obviously, to trade union groups, to women's groups. So it wasn't, although she promised to them in a usual way, oh, I'm sure we can get it in the cinema circuits. I think it had much more of a life, obviously, as a campaigning film. And I think there was also, I think, in the papers about her trying to get, or them wanting more 16mm prints so that they could show those more easily, obviously, outside of theatric situations. And she was always very good at lobbying, you know. I mean, she put in masses of work with her first film, you know, the Artists International Association. She was contacting all these artist groups to get it, you know, because she knew that it was really difficult to get it accepted on a commercial circuit. And although Rank had its own distribution because of Davis, you know, the executive, that he was so unsympathetic to documentaries. And it was really a kind of fluke almost that and it was because of Del Giudice, who was this maverick Italian producer that produced Henry V, who was kind of interested in more creative and more, you know, less supposedly commercial work, although obviously a lot of Frank's films were flops anyway. So it was just like, so so I think she was good at cultivating the right producers at that time, like Del Giudice. And she was married. Her second husband was a screenwriter, and she co-wrote things with him. So she also was good at kind of, you know, meeting the right men, which I think you had to be. Well, you still are, of course, you know, in some ways. So she knew that she needed the support from the right people. And
but I think you
quite good at trying to lobby for it. So.
Yeah, I mean, you can tell that from, you know, when she wrote for, she was the astrologer for Betty's Paper. Is it Betty's Paper? Is that what it's called? Yeah. And, you know, obviously making things up, like wildly making things up. But there's something about her that's incredibly intuitive, wasn't she? She just had this kind of skill about knowing what she needed to do and where she needed to be in the right moment.
Yes.
Which, you know, is a skill in itself.
Well, I mean, it is still a bit of a mystery, really, how she got into the film industry, apart from obviously she was writing, and she obviously had a writing skill all along, you know, even when she's writing people's, you know, boys' horoscopes and, you know, telling stories about that. She's very articulate, she's very funny and witty. And so, you know, she had this kind of cultural capital from her, albeit fragmented boarding school education. She nonetheless did have a more of an education than a lot of women did, even though she never got to, she couldn't go to university because obviously you had to pay, and she didn't have the money. But it is a bit of a mystery in a way how she did it in the first place. Once she got her chances, I'm not quite sure what the first one was. She did appear in a film, actually, as a circus performer. I've never been able to find out anything about this film, so that's interesting. Somehow she did actually get in as a performer originally.
I mean, I think, Ros, I mean, did you find that from the work that you've been doing in the archive, how some of the women that you've been looking at, how they've actually entered into the film industry, not through through learning on the job, but maybe through avenues and routes that you wouldn't have imagined?
Yeah, I'm always intrigued by this as well, because I think with Jill Craigie, she just said, I approached J. Arthur Rank as if she went directly. And similarly, like Sarah Erelka, I think, just sort of wrote to head of studios and then sort of knocked on their doors, sometimes literally, you know. So I think, and of course, the family connections. I mean, like Lizzie was saying, that always help, and the just being in the right circles. I mean, I guess, yeah, that's efforts to change that are still ongoing.
I think that's also was one of the interesting things about the status of some of the things that she said, you know, like, you know, I went to rank. Well, I don't think it was quite as straightforward as that, but she had a good way of presenting what she'd done. Like, my film, The Way We Live, you know, got the Plymouth Plan implemented, you know, got the whole of Plymouth rebuilt, you know, as she says when she approaches the equal pay campaign to make a film from. Well, that obviously is not true either. But so she's got this way of sort of this hyperbole that she's very good at. And so that's also quite tricky to know how to use that hyperbole sometimes. But yeah, so she was good at.
Marion Grierson just lacked that, I think. You know, she was very much about film as collaborative, and, you know, even she didn't even get involved in an argument about getting her name on the credits and things, you know, which some men at the time did. And I think all this doesn't help when you're trying to improve your visibility and your career.
Miscataloguing and misspelling of names, and then just leaving names out, miscrediting. Can we now, Lizzie, I just wanted to kind of talk a little bit about the kind of the third part of your film, the part that focuses on her marriage to Michael Foot. And there's some quite sensitive stuff that's being kind of expressed. Can you kind of talk a little bit how you approached that third part, the sort of the ethics around that, and also the interview that you had with her daughter, and the kind of framing and how you decided to position the kind of that end chapter in her life?
Yes, well, I mean, I did draw there. Obviously, we drew quite a lot on her own papers that were they're in the Women's Library, but also a biography written by an American biographer called Carl Rollison, who'd also interviewed members of the family and other friends of Jill Craigie's. And I spoke to other friends as well that don't appear in the film, who sort of corroborated some of the statements that Julie makes about, you know, the lack of domesticity of Michael Foot, and, you know, those elements, which I guess, you know, it's not just an individual thing. That's, you know, my father was exactly the same. You know, many men of that generation were like that. You know, and it's not, you know, it's not a personal condemnation of him as an individual. It is that is very, very many men were like that and expected to be served by their wives. So, you know, in that respect, it's a kind of political question as much as an ethical one, I think, to actually acknowledge that, because that is one, as we've been saying, you know, marriage was, you know, a big factor in these women's lives, and the expectations on them as wives, which, you know, then made it much more difficult to work in the film business. So I think for me, that's a kind of political question as much as an ethical one. And I think the film is about gender politics. It's about the gender politics of the film industry and the gender politics of the wider society, which it's linked to, which of course inevitably involves the personal sphere as well. So, you know, as I say, it wasn't intended as any kind of, you know, particularly personalized attack on anybody. It was, you know, sort of really exploring the different dimensions of her life, which, you know, no doubt had an impact on her career. But as I was trying to suggest, there were a number of things that impacted on her career. I mean, she did write to Michael Balkan in 1958, for instance, saying that she could make a famous letter, that she could make films about women and women's stories. And he basically snubbed her and said, well, I've got these other directors already, sorry. And of course, they were all men. But there was also a time that, you know, that was the film industry was shifting, and, you know, Hollywood was, you know, there was kind of a lot of difficulties in the film industry here. So, I mean, in terms of, in terms of all the material that was used in that chapter about the marriage, that was all already in the public domain, I tried to use it as kind of, well, I don't know, I didn't want to be sensationalizing, because I think when Foote died, those stories about his affairs came out in the Daily Mail, and you know, it was a sort of obviously a hatchet job, and as there had always been a hatchet job on Foote, just as there was on Corbyn, you know, for very many of the same things as well during his lifetime, going on about his clothes and how scruffy he was and all those kind of things, quite apart from, you know, the most left aspects of his politics, which of course the right-wing press never you know, always wanted to attack him for. And you know, I was believed in Foote's politics. I wasn't coming from that perspective, and that indeed is not the intention of that chapter. But it's much more related to wider questions of gender, as I say, and how the personal relates to the public and so on.
I mean, I think that's why the film is so prescient today, because obviously these are questions that we continue to ask and address to the film industry, don't we?
Yes, and I know that, you know, as I tried to, I mean, I know that she remained very committed to him, you know, and that, you know, that they did obviously love each other, you know. But you know that there were still these imbalances there, you know, inevitably.
We've got a few more questions. I just wanted to get them in before we have to finish. So one question is the decision. Could you talk a bit about your decision to mix archive material and recreations? Was that always the intention, or did you bring that? Did you bring that those techniques later on into the film?
I did always want to have reconstructions in it. I mean, how I was going to do those sort of slightly shifted, in that I originally imagined that the film would be looking back from the moment that she made her last film, and maybe having some dialogue between her and Foote, but I couldn't really. That required a more kind of developed drama scenario than I would really have been able to achieve, as I was able to quite achieve. And also I felt it would just distract from the aspects of her earlier career that I wanted to focus on in the end. But I did want to mimic, as Penny says, aspects of her hybrid style. And so in the end, in the way I did it, was more through the use of the different voices, the performed voice, versus her actual voice. The voice performed by Hayley Atwell, of course, is a very well-known actor. And so, you know, I was also wanting to emphasize the fact that this was a performance, and this was a kind of fictionalized version of Craigie rather than necessarily the truth, because any biography inevitably is a kind of, you know, reimagining of somebody's life. And I wanted the voice in a way to signal that. Yes, so there was always somebody asked me, well, why isn't there any bits of drama with Foote in, for instance? And I did have a bit where she directed him to do the narration for the last film, 2 Hours from London, because he had this very rhetorical style, and so she had to kind of tone him down for television purposes. So I had a scene where she was in a recording studio doing that with him. But actually, the problem was we already had Foote in the film. This is often a problem where you have the real person in the archive, and Foote is such a distinctive speaker. And it was just, I think, difficult to have both the actor and Foote. Somehow that didn't really. And also we had to condense, so I ended up cutting that bit out.
And I've got one final question. Can you talk a bit about Craigie's unmade film that she worked on a script for with Sylvia Pankhurst? How far down the line did that get? Well,
as I think it sort of implies in the film, in our film, basically it sort of didn't progress after a certain point, because she realized it was going to be very difficult to reconcile the suffragette factions, and that Sylvia was obviously a very kind of assertive and quite controlling person herself, and that it was actually going to be quite difficult to make a film and have Sylvia hanging around in the background, or indeed, you know, and I think she sort of slightly messed it up as well, because she approached different people as advisors and they were all, you know, there were all these factions still within the suffragette movement and tensions, and, you know, from the survivors of it, if you like, who'd of course all gone through the mill, and, you know, so, you know, they were quite traumatized, many of them, I think, and I think it just became quite difficult for her to see a way forward that was going to keep people happy, really. So I think, and also it was would have been very difficult, as she said, to get the money for it, basically.
Okay, we've got time for one more question. I think we'll fit that in. Rachel from LA has asked a question. How has Jill's life and career inspired you on a personal and professional level, Lizzie?
Oh, well, that's a nice question to finish with. Thank you very much. Well, I can see lots of, you know, well, although her life was very different from mine, you know, obviously whenever you make a biographical film, there's lots of affinities or attractions between you and the subject of your biography. So, I mean, I did really admire the way she sort of, you know, she was quite a terrier and would keep on at people, and, you know, was very determined. You know, she wouldn't take no when she in the 40s particularly, she just didn't seem to take no for an answer. And I mean, she was also just very charming as an older woman as well. I mean, just a lovely persona. I mean, maybe that doesn't come across in the film as well as I'd like it to, actually, but I think she was actually she was definitely a presence, which I think I was very impressed with, really.
Great, thank you, Lizzie. So I think we have to draw our conversation to a close, but we should just add quickly that your film is going to be, it'll be on the platform until the 17th of December, and a recording of our conversation will be on the platform too. But Lizzie, maybe you quickly tell us, it's having some in-cinema screenings as well, isn't it, before?
Yes, well, at the moment, yes, it'll be on, if you look on our website, you'll see all the updates. The next one is in Lewis Depot on the 11th, and then the 16th at the Rio, and then there'll be some other ones after that. And then obviously at the South Bank in March at Ros's event, provisionally the 5th of March, it'll be on at the South Bank, and on Ros's lovely DVD as well, and most likely on BFI Player later in the year as well. Hopefully.
Great, and we can find all that information on the Jill Craigie. What's the website again?
Well, if you just look for Jill Craigie Film Pioneer,
that's it.
It's a news section on
Right. Okay, Lizzie, thank you so much for your time and for letting us show your amazing film. And Ros, thank you so much for coming on the platform to talk about your work in the archive. It's so important, and your project, the season in March. And Penny, thank you so much. I know you're in the middle of filming yourself, so thank you so much for taking
Sorry about all the, I seem to be in a passageway, which I didn't quite realise.
It's all good. Thank you so much anyway for all three of you for coming on the platform and talking about this wonderful film and sharing your thoughts. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Selena, and thanks everyone for coming. Thank you.